I have been sitting at this kitchen table for the better part of an hour, trying to decide where to start. The coffee in front of me went cold 20 minutes ago, and I have not moved to warm it. Delia came in once, looked at me, and left without a word. She has known me 41 years. She knows the difference between a man who is resting and a man who is finally working up to something. So let me say it plainly, before I talk myself out of it again. The thing that stood at the edge of my upper meadow on a January night in 2019 was not a bear. It was not a trick of moonlight on snowpack. It was not my own fatigue translated into shapes. I have spent 33 years reading timber country in southern British Columbia, country that does not forgive poor observation, and I know what I saw. What I did not understand, not until I stood there in -19 Celsius with Buster pressed against my left leg and tears running cold on my face, was why my father had made me swear to keep that feeding station going. He never told me. He took that reason to his grave in 1987, and I have been carrying a promise I did not fully understand for 32 years since. I understand it now. I need to go back to explain how I got there. My name is Wayne Coleman. I am 72 years old. I spent 33 years working as a timber cruiser out of the Similkameen Valley in southern BC, which means I walked timber for a living, reading the land, estimating volume, mapping terrain for people whose money depended on knowing exactly what was standing in a given block of trees. A timber cruiser is not a dramatic occupation. You are on your own in deep country for long stretches, carrying a compass, a clinometer, a set of tally sheets, and enough food to keep yourself moving. You get good at reading the country because the country corrects you when you are wrong. I was wrong about a great many things in 33 years of that work. I was never wrong about a track. My father, Earl Coleman, was a timber faller. He worked with a two-man saw when he started and a chainsaw by the time he finished, and he fell the timber in the same Similkameen drainage country for over 2 decades. He was not a man who talked much. He ate quickly, repaired things thoroughly, and kept whatever he felt to himself in a way that was common to men of his era and occupation, but that still managed to feel, to a boy growing up in it, like a kind of permanent weather. He was not cold. He was just economical. He did not waste words, and because of that, the words he did choose had weight to them. I want to tell you about October 1961, because that is where this whole thing starts, but I need to tell you first what I know and what I do not know, and be honest about the line between them. I was 9 years old in October 1961. What I know about that month, I know from 3 sources. I know what my mother, Ruth, told me in the years before she died. I know what my father told me directly, which was almost nothing. And I know what is contained in a 2-page incident report filed by a man named Harlan Drost, who was the camp boss on the operation my father was working, a logging show operating in the upper Similkameen drainage east of Keremeos. I have had that report in my possession since my father's death. I have read it enough times that I could recite it, but I will not do that. I will tell you what it says in plain terms. On the morning of October the 9th, 1961, Earl Coleman did not report to the falling site. The weather that week had moved in hard and early, an October snowstorm that dropped 14 inches on the upper elevation ground over 36 hours and locked the access roads. Earl had been working a section of second-growth timber approximately 3.5 miles from the main camp. He had gone in that morning alone, as fallers frequently did, before the storm closed in fully. When he had not returned by the second evening, Drost organized a search involving 7 men. They covered the road, the skid trails, and as much of the timber as they could reach through that snow. They found his saw. They found his lunch pail tipped on its side 20 feet from the saw with the lid sprung open and the contents scattered, which they attributed to the wind. They did not find Earl. On the morning of the third day, October 12th, Earl Coleman walked into camp on his own. He had no serious injuries. He was cold. He had lost his outer jacket somewhere. He was moving stiffly, and Harlan Drost noted in his report that Coleman appeared disoriented and declined to answer questions about where he had spent the preceding 72 hours. The report uses the phrase, recovered unassisted. It is a bureaucratic phrase that closes a file. It does not describe what actually happened. My mother told me, years later, that Earl came home from that camp a changed man in one specific and observable way. He was not changed in his personality. He was not changed in his work habits or his silences, or his way of moving through a day. He was changed in his relationship to the timber country itself. She said that before October 1961, Earl had treated the bush the way most fallers treated it, as a working environment to be read and respected, but never revered. After October 1961, she said, he treated it the way a man treats a place where something important happened to him, with a care that was quiet and consistent and never explained. 2 months after he came home from that operation, in December of 1961, Earl built what I grew up calling the feeding station. It was not elaborate. It was a low platform of rough-cut lumber set on 4 short posts about 40 feet back from the tree line at the upper edge of our property outside Kerameos. He started leaving food there. Not scraps. Deliberate food, a smoked ham bone, a paper bag of dried corn, dried beans in a flat wooden tray he'd built to keep them from scattering. He checked it every 3 or 4 days and refreshed it when it was taken. I watched this for 2 years before I asked him about it. I was 9 when I asked, and I want to give you his answer exactly as I remember it, because the words are short enough that they have stayed with me whole. He said, "There's something in those hills that did me a good turn once. I don't intend to forget it." That was all. I pressed him. I was 9 years old and I wanted the story. He looked at me the way he looked at his equipment when he was checking it for a problem, level and thorough, and without any irritation. And he said, "You'll feed this station when I'm gone. That's what I need from you." I said I would, and I meant it the way a 9-year-old means a thing, which is to say I meant it fully in that moment, and could not have told you what it would cost me or what it would mean. He nodded once and walked back to the woodpile. That was the entirety of the conversation. Earl died in April of 1987, a cardiac event on a Sunday afternoon. He was 63 years old. I was 35. He had not mentioned the feeding station in the intervening years, except by the example of his own maintenance of it, which was steady and unremarkable. When he died, I took over the property and I took over the station, and I want you to understand that for a long time it was simply a thing I did because I had said I would. I did not think about it beyond that. I filled the tray. I replaced the platform boards when they rotted. I adjusted what I left based on what was and was not taken. What was taken over those early years was modest. Corn, dried beans, the occasional apple or potato. I assumed deer. I assumed raccoons or other small wildlife working the edges of the property. The evidence was consistent with that. I had no reason to think otherwise, and I want to be honest about that, because it is part of the story. I was a man of 35, then 40, then 45, trained to read country accurately, who had assigned a mundane explanation to a practice with an inexplicable origin. And that explanation was comfortable, and I did not examine it closely. I married Delia in 1991. She asked about the station once in our first year together, and I told her it was something my father had started and I had kept up. She asked if I knew why. I said I had a partial reason but not a full one. She said all right, and we did not discuss it again for a long time. That is not incuriosity on her part. That is Delia understanding that there are things a person carries forward that do not yet have enough language around them for a real conversation. I want to tell you about the 32 years between 1987 and 2019 in a way that is honest about what they felt like, which is mostly like ordinary life. I cruised timber 5 days a week through seasons that blurred into one another. I walked a lot of country alone. I got good at the particular silence of deep timber, the way sound sits in a stand of mature fir, the way a drainage sounds different in thaw than in freeze. I wore out 6 pairs of boots a year at my peak. I have a jar on the windowsill in this kitchen with 43 compass needles in it, one from each compass I carried and retired over the length of my career. And that is probably the strangest thing about me that my neighbours know. Buster came to us in 2014. He was a black and tan hound working stock out of a litter from a man over near Oliver who ran trailing dogs. I was 62 years old and I had not owned a dog for a decade, and I want to say that I got Buster strictly as a working companion. And that is the truth, but it is also true that he was good company in a way I had not anticipated needing at that point in my life. He had the quality that the best working dogs have, which is that he was calm. Not slow, not dull, calm. He did not startle at things that did not merit starting. He did not waste energy. He slept heavy and woke quick and came to the edge of situations rather than backing away from them, and I respected that in him. Now, I need to tell you about the 3 things that I tried and failed to explain away in the period between the spring of 2018 and December of 2019, because they are the honest record of how I came to be standing at that meadow edge, and I would be misrepresenting the account if I skipped them. The first was in April of 2018. I went to check the station after 2 weeks away, a stretch of spring cruising work up north that had kept me off the property. The platform had been cleared completely. Not scattered, not knocked over. Cleared the way you clear a table rather than the way a bear takes food. I had left 2 pounds of dried corn and a half-dozen apples, and there was nothing remaining except 4 apple cores placed in a neat row at the near edge of the platform. I stood there for a while. I told myself raccoons could be surprisingly tidy. I told myself I was projecting orderliness onto a random arrangement. I reloaded the station and went back to the house. The second thing was in August of 2018. I found a clear print in the mud at the lower edge of the meadow, 6 feet from the tree line. Not a bear print, though I went through the bear print checklist the way a serious person does: heel shape, toe count, claw marks, or the absence of them. 5 toes, no claws, a heel that sat deep and even, a length that I did not measure that day but that I estimated at over 14 inches. I have measured a human footprint and I knew what I was looking at. I stood there in the August sun with Buster beside me and he was not alarmed. He was attentive. His nose was working and his ears were up, and he was oriented toward the tree line, but he was steady. I told myself that a person had walked through. A hiker maybe, someone cutting across the property. I did not fully believe that, but I held it as the working explanation, and I went back to the house. The third thing was in December of 2018. I found the platform emptied again, and this time there was something left that had not been left before. A section of cedar bark about the length of my forearm placed flat in the center of the tray. It had been worked on. Not in any way I could have catalogued or described to another person in language that would hold up. But there were marks in it. Pressure marks, as if something had held it and worried at the edge with considerable force. I turned it in my hands for a long time. Then I set it on the woodpile by the back porch, and I did not throw it away, and I have it still. I told myself, that December, that I had no rational explanation for that piece of cedar bark. I stopped trying to find one. That was the first honest thing I did in this whole account, and it preceded the January night by about 3 weeks. January 14th, 2019. The cold snap had been running since the 10th. Temperatures sitting at -19 Celsius overnight, dropping to -23 on the hardest nights. The kind of cold that changes the sound the snow makes underfoot and makes the tree trunks crack like a rifle shot in the dark. I had been keeping the station stocked through it, going up every other day, which was more frequent than my usual schedule, but the cold made me think about what was moving in those hills and whether it was finding enough to eat. I went up at just past 6 in the evening on the 14th. The light was gone. I had my headlamp on, and Buster was ahead of me on the path we had worn through 30-plus years of this walk, 140 yards from the back gate to the platform. The snow was undisturbed on either side of that path except where I had made tracks 2 days before. The station had been hit. Everything I had left, 2 pounds of dried corn, a mesh bag of late storage apples from the root cellar, a hard piece of dried elk meat I had from a neighbour's hunt. All of it was gone. 3 days of food taken in the 2 days I had been away. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was the tracks. There were 4 of them in the cleared area around the platform, on the uphill side where the snow was deepest. Each one sunk 4 or 5 inches into a surface that had not given under my own weight. I knelt in the snow with my headlamp directed down, and I looked at the nearest one for a long time. Then I took off my right boot, which runs size 11, and I set it beside the track. The track was roughly twice the length of my boot, roughly twice the width across the ball. The depth told me about weight, and I have estimated load-bearing capacity in timber operations for 33 years. And I am not going to speculate beyond saying that the weight these tracks represented was not the weight of anything I had previously encountered in that country. Buster was not alarmed. That is the thing I keep coming back to, even now. He was at the edge of the platform area, nose in the cold air, steady. He looked at me once when I stood up, and then he looked toward the upper meadow. He took 2 deliberate steps in that direction and stopped, and looked back at me. I put my boot back on. I followed the tracks. They went uphill, north along the property edge and then angling into the meadow. The meadow is roughly 4 acres, open ground that I had cleared of secondary growth years ago and kept as a hay cut, bordered on its upper edge by mature timber. The tracks crossed the meadow in a line that was not a wander. It was purposeful, something that knew where it was going. I want to tell you honestly that I was not afraid. I have tried to examine that since, and I think it was partly Buster's calm, partly the fact that my father had told me decades ago that there was something in those hills that had done him a good turn, and partly something I cannot name except to say that the night felt, in some way I had no category for, like an appointment rather than an intrusion. The tracks led to the tree line at the upper meadow edge. The mature timber started there, a wall of Douglas fir that had been standing since before my father worked this country. I crossed the meadow and stopped at the tree line and played my headlamp along the edge of the timber. And then I shut the lamp off. The moon was nearly full. The snow was reflecting it. I stood in the dark for about half a minute while my eyes adjusted, and then I saw it. It was standing in the timber, back from the tree line by 30 or 40 feet, in the shadow of the firs. Even in that shadow and at that distance, the scale of it was something I felt rather than measured, the way you feel the size of a standing tree before you measure it. It was upright, completely upright. The posture was not the posture of an animal on its hind legs, which involves a kind of compensating lean, an adjustment. This was the posture of something that stood upright the way I stood upright, with no effort, with no adjustment required. It was broad through the shoulder and chest in a way that the darkness only partly concealed. The hair was dark, consistent across what I could see of the upper body, and the length of the arms was something I registered without wanting to make too much of, because I knew my own assumptions would colour what I thought I saw. What I can say is that the arms were long. It was looking at me. I knew that from the first moment. Not because I could clearly resolve the features in that light, though as the moon worked on my eyes and the snow kept giving back its own pale luminosity, I could resolve them more than I wanted to, and more than I will try to describe beyond the essential thing, which was this: the eyes were not the eyes of something that had wandered into my field of view without intending to. They held the same quality Buster's eyes held when he was paying attention to something he had already decided was not a threat. Clear, direct, and from what I could read into it. And I want to be careful here because I know I was reading in something I can only call a patient recognition. Buster sat down beside me in the snow, not pressed against my leg the way he went in weather, just sitting beside me, oriented toward the timber. I do not know how long I stood there. I have thought about it since, and my best estimate is 7 or 8 minutes, which is a long time to stand still in -19 cold. I was not cold. I did not feel cold. I'm aware that does not sound rational, and I am reporting it because it is accurate. Somewhere in those 7 or 8 minutes, I started to cry. I want to be straightforward about that because it is true. Not from fear, not from any feeling I could have named in that moment. It was the way you cry when something you have been carrying a long time is suddenly lightened, when the weight of it shifts just enough that you feel the difference, and that difference is more than you were prepared for. My father had spent 3 days somewhere in the upper Similkameen timber in October 1961, in a snowstorm that locked the roads and sent 7 men out looking for him, and turned up nothing except his saw and a spilled lunch pail. He had come home stiff and cold and short his outer jacket, and had never said one word about where he had been or what had happened to him. He had built a feeding station 2 months later and maintained it for 26 years, and passed the obligation to me with 5 words. A good turn once. Standing at that tree line in the January dark, I did the only math that has ever made sense of those 3 days. And I want to be honest that this is my own interpretation, my own tentative account of what must have happened, and not a thing I can prove. But a man who falls timber alone and goes missing in a sudden snowstorm at high elevation, who loses his saw and his lunch and his jacket, and is not found by 7 men searching for 3 days, and who comes home with no injuries and no explanation, and immediately begins providing for something in the hills that he says did him a good turn, that man was not recovered unassisted. Something found him. Something kept him out of the cold, kept him fed or sheltered or both, and moved him back toward camp when the storm broke. Something that a faller in 1961 would have had no framework to discuss, and perhaps no desire to, because explaining it would have meant explaining it. And some things resist that. I stood at the tree line and I thought about my father at 63, dying on a Sunday afternoon from a heart that had been running hard for a long time. And I thought about the 32 years I had walked that path to the platform without knowing what I was keeping faith with. And I thought about the piece of cedar bark on the woodpile that I had never thrown away. The thing in the timber stood still for what I have described as 7 or 8 minutes total, and then it moved. Not away, not immediately. It took 1 step forward into the edge of the moonlight, and I saw it more clearly than I had seen it before. And I will tell you only this about that moment. The scale of it was beyond what I had estimated from the tracks, and there was nothing in its manner that suggested threat or display. It stood in that edge of light the way a person stands when they have come to the door to see who is there and have recognized the visitor. Then it turned and walked back into the timber, unhurried, making very little sound for something of that size in crusted snow, and the timber took it back. I stood at the tree line for another few minutes. Buster did not move until I did. When I finally turned and walked back across the meadow, I felt the cold come back into my hands and face in stages, the way feeling comes back after you have been gripping something hard. The snow was bright under the moon, and the track line I had followed up from the station was still clear in it, my own boot prints beside the larger ones. I went back down the path to the house and I sat on the back steps in the cold for a while before I went inside. Delia was in the kitchen. She looked at me the way she had looked at me an hour before, reading whatever she reads in my face after 41 years of reading it. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I need to tell you something." She sat down across the table from me and I told her. I told her the whole of it. Earl's 3 days, the incident report, the feeding station, the 32 years, the tracks in the snow, and what I had seen at the tree line. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she sat with it for a while in the way she sits with things that require sitting with. Then she said, "Your father knew." I said, "Yes, he knew." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and we sat there in the kitchen with the stove ticking against the cold and did not say anything else for a long time. I went back to the station 2 days later and stocked it as I always had. I have kept stocking it in the months and years since. I am 72 years old and I do not know how many more January nights I will be capable of that walk. And I have started thinking about who the obligation passes to after me, the way my father must have thought about it when he looked at a 9-year-old boy and decided that was the right vessel for a promise he could not fully explain. There are things I have not resolved and will not resolve, and I want to name them plainly. I do not know what Earl experienced in those 3 days in the timber. I do not know if he was kept warm or just kept sheltered. I do not know whether he was fed or guided back, or both. I know he lost his jacket, and I have thought about why, and I have one theory that I hold loosely, which is that sometimes a transaction requires something given, and a jacket is a thing a man can spare. I do not know whether what I saw at the meadow edge in January 2019 is the same creature my father encountered in October 1961, because I do not know how long such things live, and I have decided that is not a question I am equipped to answer or need to. What I know is this. My father made an accounting with something that had treated him with care when he had no right to expect care, and he kept that accounting faithfully for 26 years, and he passed it to me, and I've kept it for 32 more. And on a January night in -19 cold, I stood at the edge of my own upper meadow, and something came to the tree line and looked at me, and I believe now that it was completing the same circle my father had been trying to describe to me since 1963, with a handful of words that I only understood 56 years later. I think what my father was trying to tell a 9-year-old boy was that the country is older than our accounting of it, and it keeps its own books, and if you are decent to it, you will find that it has been decent to you in ways you may not fully understand until you are standing in the snow at 67 years old with a good dog at your side, and the whole weight of a kept promise finally making sense. I have told this account in full, from beginning to end, twice. Once to Delia the night it happened. Now to you. I kept it for 5 years because telling it requires believing it, and believing it requires a certain kind of willingness to stand in a larger world than the one I was trained to measure. I am 72, and I have less to protect than I once did and more to set down before I cannot set anything down at all. That is why you are hearing this now, and not 10 years ago. My mother never accepted that Earl had been alone in those 3 days. She never said it openly. She said it the way women of her time said difficult things, through what she declined to agree with. Every time someone in Kerameos said Earl had been lucky to walk out of that country on his own, she would go quiet in a way that was not agreement. She was right. She had been right for 60 years before I finally understood what she was not saying. Harlan Drost's incident report is still in my filing cabinet in the back room. 2 pages, carbon copy, faded to near illegibility in places. It says, "Recovered unassisted." I have never corrected that record, and I do not intend to, because there is no form for the correction I would make, and because some truths are not served by official language. I still go up to the station every 3 or 4 days. I rebuilt the platform last spring with better lumber than my father used, though his original post footings are still in the ground and I left them. Buster is older now, 9 years old, his muzzle gone grey from the eyes down, and he makes the walk a little more slowly than he once did, but he makes it. He still stops sometimes at the meadow edge with his nose working and his ears up. He has done that a handful of times in the 5 years since January 2019, and I have stood with him each time and waited, and I have not seen anything I could clearly call a sighting again. I have not needed to. What I saw at that tree line was enough. It was enough for a lifetime. I have been trying in the 5 years since to understand what is owed and what is given freely, and where the line between them sits. My father spent 26 years leaving food at a platform in the timber because something had done him a good turn, and I believe he did that out of obligation. But I also believe now that the obligation became something else over time, became a kind of affection, an acknowledgement that something large and patient had moved through the same country he worked in and had chosen, 1 October, to be kind to him rather than indifferent, and that choice had changed the shape of everything that came after. That is what I am trying to set down. Delia asked me this morning whether I was going to tell the account all the way through today, and I said I thought I was finally ready. She said, "Good," and she brought me this coffee that went cold while I was working up to it, and Buster is asleep under the table with his chin on my left boot, and outside the window the upper meadow is brown with late-season grass, and the tree line at the top of it is dark in the way it is always dark, which is to say it is a darkness that watches back, and I have not found that frightening for a long time. If you have ever stood at the edge of something large and old and felt it register your presence, not as a threat, not as prey, just as a presence it chose to acknowledge, then you know something of what I am trying to put into words here. If you have not, I hope you will stand still in deep country long enough to find out. I am done keeping this to myself. I leave the rest of it with you, and with whoever you choose to pass it to. Buster shifts under the table, resettles, and his tail moves once against the kitchen floor before he goes back to sleep. That is enough for one day.